I was too young to understand cruelty, too innocent to imagine fear had a face until the day my mother whispered, "One day you'll thank me," as her trembling hands pushed me into that dark wooden room. Her voice cracked as she said it, as if she was trying to convince herself more than me, but nothing prepared me for the click of the lock sealing behind me. The moment the metal slid into place, my breath hitched, and tears burst from my eyes like they had been waiting for this exact moment to fall. I stared at her through the narrowing gap of the door, my tiny fingers reaching out desperately, but she turned her face away, unable, perhaps unwilling, to meet my gaze. I begged. I pleaded. My voice broke again and again, but she stayed silent, her shadow trembling on the other side. I didn't need a mirror to know what I looked like, my face streaked with tears, lips shaking, my chest rising and falling in panic. All I wanted was to step out into the warm hallway for just a moment, to feel air that didn't taste like dust and old wood. But the silence she gave in return made the tight room feel like it was swallowing me whole. And so, I started doing the only thing a terrified child knew how to do. I screamed. I pounded my fists against the walls until they hurt. I called for her, called for anyone, but the room devoured every sound like it had been built to erase me. Questions stabbed at my mind with every second that passed. Why was my own mother doing this? What did I do wrong? Why did she treat me like something dangerous, something that needed to be shut away? At that age, I didn't have words like protection or fear or abuse. I only knew pain, and the betrayal of the person who was supposed to love me. There was a single window, if you could even call it that, barely the size of my forearm. A thin slice of light slipped through it, almost mocking me. I would stare at it for minutes at a time, imagining squeezing through it like a shadow, imagining what freedom might feel like. But every fantasy crumbled the moment I heard the heavy footsteps echoing from the hallway. My father. Even before he appeared, his rage filled the air like smoke. The way the floor vibrated beneath his weight made my stomach twist. He was shouting even before he reached my mother, his voice thick with alcohol, the venom of a man who used anger as a language. I could hear her whisper something, a plea, maybe an explanation, but he didn't let her finish. His hand struck her so loudly it felt like the sound punched through the walls and into my bones. Then he hit her again. And again. With every slap, she apologized in a voice so small, so full of shaking breath, that the apology itself sounded like it was afraid. I pressed my ear to the door, but part of me didn't want to hear more. The violence wasn't new. It had been the soundtrack of my childhood, ringing through nights and early mornings. But this time, trapped inside that tiny room, unable to reach her, unable to shield her or hide with her, it felt worse, like I was suffocating under the weight of my own helplessness. My father's anger was a storm without an end. He had no limits, no breaks, no moments of tenderness hidden somewhere beneath the chaos. He tore into me with the same brutality he reserved for her. To him, I was another threat, another thing he couldn't control. He drank himself deeper into madness, the stench of alcohol becoming so familiar that even now, years later, I sometimes smell it when there's nothing there. The doctors eventually said he was dying, that his liver had given up on the idea of keeping him alive. Instead of softening him, the knowledge only sharpened his edges. He hated the idea of becoming small, weak, mortal. So he lashed out harder, hit me faster, screamed louder. And every time I tried to defend my mother or myself, he dragged me down the hallway and threw me into that same small room. The door would slam shut, and the lock would click, and my mother, crying, always crying, would turn the key with shaking hands. "It's to protect you," she'd whisper through the door. "It's the only way." But nothing about that room ever felt protective. It felt like abandonment wrapped in the disguise of safety, and though I didn't understand her choices, a small part of me hated her for them. As I grew older, fear seeped into every part of who I was. Loud sounds made me flinch. Quick movements made my breath stutter. I spoke less because speaking invited attention, and attention invited pain. I avoided people because I no longer trusted that kindness was real. And inside me, something else grew, a spark of rage that waited silently, waiting for the smallest reason to erupt. Yet despite everything, nothing prepared me for the day my world finally snapped apart. I was 12. That morning, my mother woke me gently. She brushed my hair out of my eyes with soft fingers, the same fingers that had locked me away so many times before. But her smile that morning was gentle, almost peaceful. She kissed my forehead. She called me her brave boy. She placed breakfast in my hands like it was a gift from a universe that had forgotten us. I didn't know it then, but that moment, simple, warm, ordinary, was the final memory I would ever create with her. Because later that day, I walked into the hallway and saw her body lying there like a fallen leaf. Still. Pale. Silent. The world didn't slow down, it stopped altogether. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands shaking as they reached for hers. Her skin was cold. Her chest didn't rise. Her lips didn't move. No matter how many times I whispered, "Mom, please wake up," she stayed motionless. The grief that hit me wasn't just pain, it was the collapse of everything I had left. And as I held her hand that final time, something inside me broke in a way I'm not sure ever healed. When my mother died, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the silence she left behind. A silence so sharp it could cut through bone. A silence so heavy it sat on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I kept waiting to hear her soft footsteps in the hallway, the gentle sound of her humming in the kitchen, or even the quiet crack in her voice when she whispered my name. But the house stayed still, as if it had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. I didn't understand how someone who had always been there, someone who had endured so much pain just to keep me breathing, could suddenly vanish from the world like smoke disappearing into cold air. I kept asking myself if she had known. If she had felt it coming. If that final morning, when she smiled at me and kissed my forehead, she knew it would be the last time. Maybe her gentleness that day wasn't ordinary, it was her goodbye. People arrived soon after, neighbors, relatives, officers. Their voices filled the house like unwanted intruders, loud and sharp, when all I wanted was quiet. They asked questions, whispered to each other, stared at me like I was some tragic story they were trying to piece together. A few women tried touching my shoulder, offering sympathy that felt empty, rehearsed, like they had practiced the same words at 100 different funerals. I didn't want comfort, I wanted my mother. When the police took my father to the hospital, I felt nothing at first. No relief, no anger, not even fear. My emotions were numb, frozen beneath the shock of losing her. I watched him being lifted into the ambulance, his skin grey, his eyes sunken, his breaths ragged and shallow. He looked nothing like the monstrous force that had ruled our home for years. He looked small, fragile, even. But fragile or not, I couldn't forget what he had done. At the hospital, the doctors moved around him briskly. Their white coats rustled like wings, their voices low but urgent. They asked him what happened to my mother, but he wouldn't answer. His silence screamed louder than any confession. He looked at the ceiling instead of their faces, as if staring at something only he could see. Maybe he saw her. Maybe he saw the years of pain he inflicted. Or maybe he saw nothing, because maybe there was nothing inside him left to see. The police questioned me too. They sat me down in a cold room with buzzing lights and asked if I ever saw him hit her, if I ever heard him threaten her, if I believed he killed her. I wanted to answer. I wanted to scream. But every memory was tangled, blurred by years of fear, locked doors, muffled screams, and shadows moving behind thin walls. I didn't know what to say, and the truth was too heavy for a 12-year-old to carry alone. So I said nothing. I didn't know whether she died from the bruises he left or the heartbreak he carved into her. I didn't know if she collapsed under the weight of his violence or if life simply gave up on her the way she had always given up her own peace for mine. All I knew was that she was gone, and it felt like someone had stolen the only person who ever tried to love me in a world that refused to give me anything but pain. 2 weeks later, my father died. When the news reached me, I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't feel the desire to celebrate or mourn. It was as if the universe had flicked him off the map and expected me to react, but I had no reaction left. People around me spoke about him with a softness that made me sick. They said things like he had a hard life, or he struggled with his health, or he wasn't a bad man, just troubled. I wanted to shout at them. I wanted to tell them the truth. I wanted them to hear the sound of my mother's sobs echoing through thin walls. I wanted them to feel the way my skin stung when his belt struck it. I wanted them to know he was not a man worth forgiving. But I stayed quiet, because I learned long ago that silence was safer. I didn't attend his funeral. I couldn't. The thought of seeing his face, even lifeless, twisted my stomach. Let others pretend he was a good man, they didn't live with him. They didn't spend nights locked in a room because of him. They didn't watch their mother break down day after day until the last piece of her finally disappeared. After both of them were gone, you'd think life would suddenly become lighter, like the end of a storm, when the sky opens up and sunlight pours through. But for me, the storm didn't end, it just shifted. Without my parents, I wasn't free. I was lost. People spoke about me everywhere I went. They didn't whisper quietly, they whispered loud enough for me to hear. Some said my mother took her own life. Some insisted my father beat her to death. Some wondered if I played a part in it, because a house like ours birthed nothing but tragedy. Others pitied me, which somehow felt worse than blame. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that truth itself was something I couldn't untangle. I wandered through life like a shadow, not belonging, not speaking, not living. Every corner of the world seemed to remind me of something I wanted to forget. The sound of keys locking a door. A glass breaking. A man raising his voice. A woman apologizing too quickly. Even silence felt dangerous. And then, she appeared. Lily. She didn't enter my life loudly. She didn't offer sympathy or ask invasive questions. She simply noticed me in a world where I thought I had become invisible. Her voice was warm in a way that didn't feel forced. Her presence didn't demand anything from me. She didn't flinch at my quietness or avoid me because of the rumors that followed me like a shadow. For reasons I still don't understand, she stayed. She became the first light I had ever seen that didn't burn. The first voice that didn't threaten. The first person who made me feel like maybe my story wasn't over. But life has a cruel way of taking anything good I touch. And eventually, the past began to creep back in, through nightmares, memories, echoes that refused to die. And that was only the beginning. Lily didn't save me all at once. Healing wasn't a miracle that arrived in a single moment, it was a slow, trembling journey, stitched together through her patience and the quiet strength she carried. When she first walked into my life, I was still living inside the ghost of my past. Every step I took felt uncertain, like I was tiptoeing around invisible traps. But Lily, she moved through the world with softness, the kind that made even silence feel safe. We met in a place most people would forget, a narrow street behind my school where I often sat alone, pretending I was invisible. She walked by one day, her backpack bouncing lightly, her hair catching the sunlight like strands of fire. She didn't pass without looking, she stopped. She saw me. It was the first time in years someone looked at me not with pity, not with judgment, but with something gentler. Something curious. Something human. "Are you okay?" she asked. No one had asked me that in a long time. Not like they meant it. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice. I didn't trust myself not to fall apart in front of her. But she didn't walk away. She sat down next to me, leaving just enough space so I wouldn't feel trapped, but close enough for me to know she wasn't afraid. Her presence felt different, warm, real, steady. I wasn't used to steadiness. Over the next days, then weeks, she kept showing up. Sometimes she talked, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she told me stories about her family, her dreams, her fears. Other times she just sat beside me, letting the silence settle naturally between us, without pressure or expectation. She made silence feel like a choice, not a punishment. Little by little, I started speaking to her. At first just a few words. Then sentences. Then pieces of the truth I had never told anyone. She didn't flinch when I talked about the dark room or my father's temper or the nights when my mother cried against the kitchen sink. Instead of pulling away, she leaned closer, metaphorically, not physically, like she wanted to understand, not out of curiosity, but out of care. And I found myself wanting to talk. Wanting to be understood. Wanting to be more than just the broken boy everyone whispered about. She became my anchor in a world where I constantly felt like I was drifting. With her, I learned how to breathe again without waiting for something terrible to happen. I learned to laugh awkwardly at first, then fully, freely, the way children are supposed to. She taught me that there were people who didn't raise their hands in anger, who didn't use silence like a weapon, who didn't see vulnerability as weakness. And in her eyes, I saw a version of myself I never believed existed, someone worthy of being loved. But the past never truly leaves you. It lingers like smoke trapped in your clothes, like the aftertaste of something bitter that refuses to fade. At night, the nightmares returned, clawing at the fragile peace I was building. I'd dream of locked doors, of muffled screams, of my father's shadow stretching across the room. I'd wake up breathless, soaked in sweat, trembling so hard I could barely hold a glass of water. Lily tried to help. She held my hands when they shook. She listened when I couldn't explain what I was feeling. She told me I wasn't alone. But nightmares don't obey kindness. Trauma doesn't bow to love. And little by little, I began slipping away from her, not because she wasn't enough, but because the darkness inside me grew louder than her voice. I became restless. Distracted. The smallest things set me off, doors closing too loudly, footsteps behind me, a stranger raising their voice. I snapped at her sometimes, not in anger, but out of fear I didn't know how to control. She never snapped back. She never left. But I could see the worry growing in her eyes, soft and helpless, like she didn't know how to save me from something she couldn't see. And then, without warning, without reason, without the universe showing the slightest mercy, she was gone. Her death didn't come with shouts or violence or the chaos that had stolen my mother. It was quiet, quick, sudden. One moment she was there laughing, breathing, alive, and the next she wasn't. The world didn't give me time to prepare, or even to understand. It just ripped her away from me like she was another thing I wasn't allowed to keep. The day I found out, something inside me collapsed. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, numb, staring at nothing. It felt unreal, like the universe had made some cruel mistake, like it had confused her with someone else. But as the truth sank in, as the finality of her death wrapped around me, grief hit me with a force I didn't know how to survive. This grief wasn't like losing my mother. That had shattered me as a child, before I knew how to stand on my own. But losing Lily, losing her felt like losing the piece of myself she had helped me build. She had been the light that guided me out of my shadows. And without her, the darkness returned, stronger, hungrier, more familiar than I wanted to admit. Every memory of her became a blade that cut deeper each time I touched it. Her smile, her laugh, her gentle voice, they all turned into ghosts that followed me everywhere. I saw her in places she had never been. I heard her voice in crowds when no one had spoken. I woke up imagining her hand reaching for mine, only to find emptiness. Her absence swallowed me whole. I didn't return to that narrow street behind my school. I didn't talk to anyone. I drifted through the days like a shadow wearing human skin. Grief wasn't just an emotion, it became my home, my punishment, my constant companion. And slowly, painfully, the world lost its color again. Food tasted like nothing. Sleep felt like a battlefield. Life felt like a burden I didn't ask for. I told myself I didn't deserve love. I didn't deserve light. Everyone I cared about either broke or disappeared. And the truth I refused to speak out loud settled deep inside me. I believed I was cursed. I believed I was dangerous. I believed that loving me was a risk no one should take. And as the years passed, the boy who once longed for warmth learned to survive without it. After Lily's death, life didn't just dim, it folded in on itself. Days blurred into nights, nights bled into mornings, and I lived inside a silence that felt thicker than the walls of that childhood room where my mother used to lock me in. Except this time, no one turned the key. This time, the door was open, but I didn't step out. Grief became the air I breathed, heavy, slow, suffocating. I walked through the world like I had been emptied out and forgotten. People around me talked, laughed, argued, lived, but their voices sounded distant, as if I were underwater. My own voice was a stranger to me. I avoided mirrors because I hated the eyes staring back, hollow, tired, carrying the weight of too many ghosts. Losing Lily after losing my mother felt like the universe taking every piece of warmth I had ever touched. I couldn't understand why it kept happening, why the people I loved were always the ones forced to leave. I told myself it was my fault, even when no one actually said it. My heart became a place where guilt grew like weeds, twisted, stubborn, impossible to remove. And so I built my life around survival instead of living. I went to school, came home, kept my head down. I passed exams without remembering a single lesson. I aged, but I didn't grow. I existed, but I didn't feel alive. The boy I was became a distant shadow trailing behind me, a wounded child who never found a way to rest. The world kept moving, but I stayed stuck in the moment Lily disappeared. Years went by, and somewhere along the path between loneliness and adulthood, I met someone. Her presence didn't strike me like lightning, didn't sweep me off my feet the way Lily's presence once had. Instead, she came softly, like rain that you don't notice until your skin is already wet. She wasn't Lily, and she wasn't meant to be. She was simply someone who didn't turn away when she saw the quiet sadness in my eyes. We weren't perfect. I wasn't ready. I loved her in a quiet, fragile way, always afraid that if I reached too far, if I wanted too much, the universe would punish me again. But she was patient. She gave me space when I withdrew, and she didn't force me to speak before I was ready. Her presence was gentle enough to not scare me away, strong enough to remind me I was not completely alone. And for a while, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could build something new. But the past has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a whisper, a shadow, a memory that knocks on your door at 3 a.m. It started with small things. A slammed door. A raised voice. A faint argument outside the apartment building. Each sound cracked open the old wounds I thought I had buried. My heart raced at the slightest noise. I woke up drenched in sweat from dreams of my father's footsteps, of my mother's muffled cries, of Lily lying still. Every emotion felt too big, too sharp, too heavy. And instead of reaching for help, I did what I had learned to do as a child. I withdrew. The anger I carried wasn't the anger of violence. It wasn't rage aimed at others. It was fear turned inward, a burning panic that something inside me would one day snap the way my father did. I never raised my hand. I never shouted. But inside, I felt a storm building, and I was terrified of what might happen if it broke loose. When she told me she was pregnant, my world froze. Not in joy. Not in fear. In something far more confusing, a collision of both. I wanted to be happy. I wanted to believe that life was giving me a chance to rewrite my story. But as her belly grew, so did the panic clawing at my chest. I remembered the nights I had been locked in that wooden room. I remembered my mother whispering apologies through the door. I remembered the terror I felt when my father walked toward me. And suddenly, I wasn't afraid of the child. I was afraid of myself. I didn't trust my bloodline. I didn't trust the echoes of the man whose shadows shaped my childhood. I didn't trust the anger that lived deep inside me, the kind that stayed quiet until something triggered it. I had spent years convincing myself I was nothing like him, but what if trauma was inherited? What if pain was passed down the way eye color and height were? What if I became him? The thought poisoned me. It consumed me. It kept me awake for nights, staring at the ceiling, trembling with the weight of a future I wasn't sure I deserved. And in the end, fear made the choice for me. I left. Not because I didn't love my daughter. Not because I didn't love her mother. But because the thought of my child ever looking at me with the same fear I once had for my father was a nightmare I couldn't live with. Leaving felt like ripping out a part of my own soul, but I convinced myself it was the only way to protect her from my past, from my bloodline, from me. I walked away with a heart full of guilt and a mind full of chaos. I imagined my daughter growing up thinking I abandoned her, thinking she wasn't enough. I hated myself for that, but I hated the possibility of becoming my father even more. I thought distance would keep her safe. But distance didn't heal me. It didn't save me. It didn't erase the past or silence the nightmares. It only added another layer of pain to a story already overflowing with it. Years passed, and every so often, I would catch myself wondering about her, what color her eyes were, whether she smiled like her mother, whether she laughed the way Lily used to. I didn't dare try to see her from afar or ask questions. I didn't believe I had the right. I simply carried her memory like a silent prayer I didn't believe I was allowed to speak. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything life has taken and everything I have lost, I realize something I never allowed myself to admit. I didn't leave because I was a monster. I left because I was terrified of becoming one. But fear, I've learned, is its own kind of prison, one I never managed to escape. Time had a way of passing without permission, slipping through fingers like sand, indifferent to the chaos and heartbreak of my life. I moved from city to city, apartment to apartment, job to job, always careful never to get too close, always careful never to leave footprints anyone could follow. I built walls around myself that I convinced myself were protection, but in truth, they were isolation. The world was dangerous, and I was fragile. I had survived the unthinkable, and the only way I thought I could keep surviving was to hide, even from love, even from hope. But life has a persistence that cannot be ignored. One day, a letter arrived, yellowed and soft at the edges, with my daughter's name on it. Her handwriting, hesitant and awkward, carried a weight I hadn't realized I had longed for: connection. She was old enough now to ask questions, old enough to understand, old enough to reach out. I sat frozen, letter trembling in my hands, memories of my childhood, Lily, my mother, the locked rooms, the shadows of my father, all colliding into a storm I had tried to forget. Her words were simple, honest, and full of longing. I don't understand why you left, but I want to know you. I want to meet you. I stared at the page for hours. I wanted to curl up and disappear, to hide from the guilt that came crashing like waves. But beneath the fear, something else stirred: hope. A quiet, fragile spark. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim some part of the life I had abandoned. That maybe I could learn how to be present, to be human, to be the father I had always been too afraid to try to be. I wrote back. I kept my words measured, careful, but honest. I told her that I had left out of fear, not lack of love. I told her that I had spent years running, trying to outrun the shadows of my past, but that they had never stopped following me. I told her that I was ready now, if she would let me, to begin the slow, painful, beautiful work of building something real between us. The first meeting was quiet, awkward, and charged with emotion. She looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize, hers, but so like mine, and I felt the weight of every lost year pressing against my chest. I wanted to fall to my knees and apologize for every moment I hadn't been there, for every memory she had to face alone, for every heartbeat I wasn't there to protect. But I didn't. I held her hands, and we just sat together in silence, letting the presence of each other do what words could not. And then, slowly, the ice began to crack. We talked, not about anger, not about blame, but about us. About what it meant to be alive. About fear and grief and loss. About the pieces of life we had each carried alone, and how maybe now, we could carry some of them together. She laughed once, lightly, the sound like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and my chest felt lighter than it had in decades. It wasn't magic. It wasn't immediate forgiveness or instant healing. But it was a beginning. For the first time in my life, I realized that love didn't have to be dangerous. That connection didn't have to destroy me. That family, my family, could exist beyond the shadows of my father, beyond the locked rooms and the pain, beyond the grief that had been my constant companion. I started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me unpack the terror I had carried since childhood, who guided me through the rage, the guilt, the heartbreak, and taught me that survival alone wasn't enough. That living was something I had to learn, step by step, moment by moment. I learned how to cry without shame, how to sleep without fear, how to let people in without fearing they would leave me, too. And with each session, with each small act of trust, I began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: hope. Not the naive hope of a child dreaming of a perfect life, but a grounded, stubborn, resilient hope, the kind that grows slowly in broken soil, nourished by the small acts of courage it takes to face the past and keep walking anyway. My daughter became my anchor. Every time she laughed, every time she hugged me, every time she asked me a question about the world and expected an answer, I felt my life unfolding into something real. I realized that the love I had thought I could never give because of the monster inside me could, in fact, be shaped, tempered, and offered without fear. I realized that the past did not have to define the future. That my history of violence, pain, and loss was not a prophecy of what I would become, but a testament to what I had survived. And then came the day when I took her to the place where Lily and my mother were buried. I held her hand as we stood in front of the gravestones, the wind tugging at our hair. I told her stories of the women who had shaped my life, the women who had loved me despite my flaws, the women whose absence had taught me both pain and resilience. She listened, wide-eyed and silent, absorbing every word, and I felt a strange peace. For the first time in my life, I understood that love wasn't just a memory or a ghost or a shadow. It was alive, present, and patient. It was in the hands I held, the laughter we shared, the small moments of connection that built something stronger than fear. I started volunteering at a community center, helping at-risk youth, sharing my story cautiously, carefully, in hopes that someone else could find the path I had nearly missed. I discovered that pain, when faced with courage, can transform into purpose. That the cycle of abuse, fear, and running could be broken, one act of kindness at a time. And finally, after decades of running from shadows, I let myself live. I let myself love without trembling. I let myself hope without hiding. I became not the boy locked in a wooden room, not the terrified man who fled from fatherhood, but someone shaped by every heartbreak and still willing to reach toward light. The world never promised justice or fairness. It never promised Lily, or my mother, or even the life I dreamed of. But it did offer the chance to choose, to be present, to be human, to love, to care, to live fully, despite everything. And that, I realized, was more than I ever thought I would have. I still remember the dark room, the locked door, the shadows of my father. I remember the pain, the grief, the loneliness. But now, I also remember the warmth of holding my daughter's hand, the gentle strength of someone who didn't abandon me, the fragile light that broke through the darkness and refused to be snuffed out. I survived. I loved. I lived. And for the first time, I understood that maybe, just maybe, the scars were not just proof of pain, but proof of survival, proof of resilience, proof that life, no matter how cruel, always leaves room for hope. Because hope, I learned, is not the absence of fear or loss. It is the courage to move forward, one trembling step at a time, carrying the broken pieces of the past, and still daring to build a future where love, not terror, defines you. And that is how I finally began to breathe, not just exist, not just survive, but truly breathe, in a world that had tried so long to break me, but never quite succeeded.